The scream echoed through the office, piercing and desperate. No one could ignore it. It all started when I joined the company. I was happy to get the job. It was hard to find work in our town, so when I got the offer, I was excited. The HR manager, Mrs. Okoro, seemed nice at first. She welcomed me with a big smile and showed me around. But soon, I learned about her dark side. Mrs. Okoro was strict and mean. She loved power and control. She fired people for small mistakes and humiliated them in front of everyone. People were afraid of her, but no one dared to speak up. We all needed the job. One day, I saw her true wickedness. There was an employee, Ayo, who was always cheerful and hardworking. He had a wife and 2 kids. One afternoon, Ayo's mother fell ill. He asked Mrs. Okoro for permission to leave early to take her to the hospital. She refused, saying the work was more important. Ayo pleaded with her, but she didn't care. She threatened to fire him if he left. Ayo stayed, but his mind was elsewhere. Later that evening, we all heard a loud scream. It was Ayo. He had just received a call that his mother had passed away. The office fell silent, and everyone looked at Mrs. Okoro. She didn't even flinch. She just told him to get back to work. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how cold and heartless she was. The next morning, Ayo didn't show up. We later found out he was in the hospital. He had tried to take his own life out of grief and guilt. This news spread through the office like wildfire. People were horrified, but Mrs. Okoro showed no remorse. Weeks passed, and the office became a place of dread. One evening, while working late, I heard whispers about a curse. Some older employees said that long ago, a wicked woman in the village was cursed by a shaman for her cruelty. They said the spirit of that woman had taken over Mrs. Okoro. I didn't believe in curses, but I knew one thing for sure. Mrs. Okoro was a monster. One night, while walking to my car, I heard someone crying. It was faint but clear. I followed the sound and found Ayo's wife, Bisi. She was begging Mrs. Okoro to have mercy, to let Ayo return to work once he was better. Mrs. Okoro laughed and told her to leave or she would call security. Bisi left in tears, and Mrs. Okoro turned and saw me. Her eyes were cold, and she said, "Mind your own business if you want to keep your job." I nodded and hurried away, my heart pounding. After that, I noticed strange things happening around the office. Lights flickering, shadows moving in empty rooms, and whispers when no one was there. It felt like the building was alive and angry. People said it was Ayo's spirit seeking revenge. One late evening, I stayed behind to finish some work. The office was quiet, too quiet. Suddenly, I heard footsteps, but when I looked, no one was there. The air turned cold, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned around and saw a shadowy figure. It was Ayo. He looked sad and pointed towards Mrs. Okoro's office. Gathering my courage, I went to her office. The door was slightly open, and I peeked inside. Mrs. Okoro was there, but she wasn't alone. The room was filled with shadows, and I could hear faint whispers. Her face was twisted in fear, and she was begging for mercy. I couldn't move. The shadows closed in on her, and then the lights went out. When they came back on, Mrs. Okoro was gone. The office was empty, and there was no trace of her. The next day, the higher-ups said she had resigned suddenly and left town. No one ever saw her again. Ayo returned to work a few weeks later, but he was different. He never talked about what happened. The office slowly returned to normal, but we all knew things would never be the same. The legend of the wicked HR manager who vanished became a whispered tale in our town, a reminder of the darkness that can live in people's hearts. But this wasn't the end of the story. After Mrs. Okoro disappeared, strange things continued to happen. People reported seeing shadows moving on their own, hearing faint whispers in the hallways, and feeling a cold presence around the office. Some said it was Ayo's spirit still seeking justice, while others believed it was the curse of the wicked woman taking its final toll. One evening, as I was leaving late, I noticed a strange light coming from Mrs. Okoro's old office. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to take a look. The door was unlocked, which was odd, because it had been sealed after she left. I pushed it open and saw something that made my blood run cold. On the desk was a small, old-looking box. It was intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. As I stepped closer, the room grew colder, and I heard faint whispers around me. I reached out to touch the box, but as soon as my fingers made contact, a sharp pain shot through my hand. I pulled back and saw a small cut on my palm, blood slowly oozing out. Panicked, I stumbled out of the office and ran home. That night, I had vivid nightmares. I saw Mrs. Okoro surrounded by shadows, her face twisted in agony. She was reaching out to me, her eyes pleading for help. I woke up drenched in sweat. The image of her haunted face burned into my mind. The next day, I tried to tell my colleagues about what I saw, but no one believed me. They thought I was just stressed and imagining things. But I knew what I saw was real. The box, the whispers, the shadows. Everything felt too real to be just a dream. Determined to find answers, I started researching the symbols I saw on the box. After days of searching, I found an old book in the town library that mentioned similar symbols. They were related to ancient rituals used to trap and control spirits. According to the book, these rituals were used by shamans to bind wicked souls and prevent them from causing harm. I realized that the box in Mrs. Okoro's office might have been a prison for the wicked spirit that had possessed her, the spirit of the cruel woman from the old village legend. Somehow, the box had been opened, releasing the spirit into our office. I knew I had to do something before more harm came to my colleagues or me. With the help of the book, I learned how to perform a ritual to trap the spirit back into the box. One night, after everyone had left, I returned to the office with the book and the necessary items for the ritual. The office was eerily quiet as I set up the ritual in Mrs. Okoro's old office. The air grew colder with each passing moment, and I could feel the presence of the spirit watching me. I started chanting the incantation from the book, focusing all my energy on trapping the spirit. As I chanted, the shadows in the room began to move, swirling around me like a dark vortex. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. I kept chanting, refusing to let fear take over. The shadows closed in, and just as I felt like I couldn't continue any longer, a blinding light filled the room. When the light faded, the shadows were gone, and the room was silent. The box on the desk was glowing faintly, and I knew the spirit had been trapped once again. Exhausted but relieved, I sealed the box and left the office. The next day, the atmosphere in the office was different. The cold presence was gone, and the whispers had stopped. People seemed happier, and the fear that had lingered for so long had lifted. I knew we were finally free from the wicked spirit's grasp. Ayo eventually recovered and returned to work, his old cheerful self slowly coming back. We never spoke about the events that had transpired, but we all knew we had been through something extraordinary and terrifying. The legend of the wicked HR manager and the cursed box became a story passed down through the company, a reminder of the darkness that once haunted us. And although the box was hidden away, I kept the old book with me, just in case the spirit ever returned.